Hello, and welcome to the 17th chapter of our Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe discussion. I'm Jem, the reader at St John the Baptist Parish Church in Beeston, and the chapter we're going to be looking at this time is The Hunting of the White Stag. It runs from the battle was all over a few minutes after their arrival, and it runs to, but if the professor was right, it was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia. So scurry away and read it if you haven't already. This is the last chapter of the book. It's not the last episode, because I'm going to be doing a sort of roundup episode next time, talking about what's come out of the novel that I hadn't expected, what this process has been like. Spoilers, it's been immensely fun. There's all sorts of things that I've noticed or been sort of forced into noticing by taking this chapter by chapter approach. It's really deepened my understanding of the book, and there's all sorts of things that have sort of crept out of the textual woodwork, as it were. So I thought I'd look at some of the themes that haven't been so obvious to me until I did this process. And I'll also be looking at some of the comments that people have made, because there have been some really interesting responses. So that's the next episode, but this one is Chapter 17, The Hunting of the White Stag. So in it, we have the end of the battle against the White Witch, Edmund's wounds, Lucy's healing him, the travelling of the children to Cair Paravel, their coronation, the disappearance of Aslan, the ruling of the children over Narnia, and the quest for the White Stag, which ends with them leaving Narnia. So it's I think worth looking at the transition that's happening here. So we've got the narrative, which has been moving sort of very quickly up to this point, and Edmund is wounded in the battle. Peter explains that it was him that really saved them all. He had the sense to go for the White Witch's wand rather than trying to kill her and getting turned to stone for his trouble like everyone else did. And there's this scene here. They found Edmund in the charge of Mrs. Beaver a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood. His mouth was open and his face a nasty green colour. Quick, Lucy, said Aslan. And then almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial that had been given her for a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed it in the end and poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. There are other people wounded, said Aslan while she was looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have any results. Yes, I know, said Lucy crossly. Wait a minute. Daughter of Eve, said Aslan in a graver voice. Others also are at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund? And Lucy goes away and tends to the wounds and apologises to Aslan. A certain amount going on there. I know I've been harping on this string all the way through the book, but I was really struck by the use of the word line here. She found Edmund in the charge of Mrs. Beaver a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood, his mouth was open, and his face a nasty green colour. Now, I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of children's literature or fantasy before this point, but this strikes me as a surprisingly realistic representation of someone who's just been in a battle against a witch and against hags and magical balls and all sorts of things. First of all, the use of the word line, of course, familiar, the lines that we see in the First World War. And of course, Lewis served in that war, as did Tolkien, and it influenced his generation's view of what war was. Just so the issue of him sort of being a funny colour and his mouth lolling open. Again, it's touched relatively lightly, but I think it's worth pointing out that I can't remember that sort of detail appearing in sort of heroic children's fiction before this point. I may well be wrong, but this seems to be a moment where we see the unpleasantness of war rather than sort of the heroism and the glory of it, that it leaves people wounded and sort of lolling around afterwards. Lucy then heals him, so it's a relatively quick moment, rather like I think the preparation of Edmund for death, where it's there but it's moved over relatively quickly, so that the children needn't notice it, so to speak. And she heals him and is concerned with sort of looking after him. And Aslan says, "Go and tend to other people." And she says, "Oh, wait." And Aslan brings up, you might think somewhat tactlessly, the question of people dying for Edmund's sake. And I think that's interesting. Obviously, it's an important character point. Everyone's learning something. But I think there is perhaps a broader sense here that, pardon me, Edmund has been brought back into the family, the nation or the community or whatever you like to call it, has been redeemed in that sense, and that it shouldn't turn inwards. Lucy, as a member of this family, who's got this marvelous power of the cordial, this healing potential, shouldn't simply use that within the community. It should be turned outwards. It should be given up for others. It should be put at the service of others, perhaps, is a better way of saying it. Having got Edmund back and being the four marvellous Pevensies once more, it seems important here that they don't simply use their powers inside the circle, so to speak, or inside the square. And I think there's an obvious, I don't know, parallel there, an obvious echo with the idea of what it is that Christians are to do with the knowledge of what's been given up with for them. That they are not simply to turn that into an inward-looking and self-satisfied and a purity movement. That is it's to evoke in them a sense of service outside their own community. Then we move on to a very casual mention of how much better Edmund is looking. Healed of his wounds, looking better than she had seen him look, for ages, in fact, ever since his first term at that horrid school, which was where he had begun to go wrong. He had become his real old self again and could look you in the face, and there on the field of battle, Aslan made him a knight. That's interesting, because there's a very casual reference earlier where Peter says, you haven't been, or you've been a rotter ever since you came back from school that first term. We haven't had a lot of explanation all the way through that it's been school that's been the problem, so it's quite surprising, I think, to have it pop up there. It does fit with something I've been saying all along, though. Lewis's suspicion of systematising, of institutions to make people good. And that's, I think, a suspicion that all sorts of speculative fiction writers share, all sorts of fantasy sci-fi writers look at Clockwork Orange or 1984, or the suspicion of systems to make people good and to solve metaphysical or human problems is one that has a significant history in sort of non-realistic writing. And here I think it comes out. Lewis instinctually shows his what we might unkindly call his prejudices, or what we might more kindly and more reasonably and generously call his principles, the way he thinks the world works. So the children go to Cair Paravel and they do a bit of paddling, and then there is a more noble, a more solemn scene. But the next day was more solemn, for then in the great hall of Cair Paravel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof and west wall hung with peacock's feathers, and the eastern door which looks towards the sea, in presence of all their friends, to the sound of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them to the four thrones amid deafening shouts of "Long live King Peter, long live Queen Susan, long live King Edmund, long live Queen Lucy. Once a king or queen in Narnia, always a king or queen in Narnia. Bear it well, sons of Adam, bear it well, daughters of Eve," said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids swimming close to the shore and singing in honour of their new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones, and sceptres were put into their hands, and they gave rewards and honours to all their friends, to Tumnus the fawn, and to the beavers, and giant Rumblebuffin, and to the leopards, and the good centaurs, and the good dwarves, and to the lion. And that night there was a great feast in Cair Paravel, and revelry and dancing, and gold flashed, and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing, came the music of the sea people. But amidst all these rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away, and when the kings and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it, for Mr. Beaver had warned them. "He'll be coming and going," he had said. "One day you'll see him, and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, and of course he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in. Only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know. Not like a tame lion." And I've read almost 2 pages out because it just rolls on, doesn't it? It's marvellous stuff. Lots to unpack there, as many a tutor has said over the years. So the solemnity and the majesty of the hall, I was struck, the ivory and the peacock's feathers and the eastern door that opens to the sea. I don't know whether I'm jumping on things. I probably am. It's difficult not to when you've been doing 16 previous chapters of over-reading stuff. Ivory and peacocks and the east. Solomon, anyone? I think, maybe? We're certainly in the world of the Hebrew scriptures, of glorious buildings and feasting, and this being sort of right and proper, and it being a way of responding to the glory of God. Ivory and peacocks, I think, do have a slightly Solomonic air. And the eastern door, which looks towards the sea. Again, they've been travelling east all this time, and they've got to the most eastern point, this sort of almost like a holy castle of Cair Paravel, and the doors are open, and you can see even further east, though you can't walk there, obviously, as they've been walking so far, and it opens towards the sea, and of course it is across the sea from the east that Aslan comes. So there is this continuous journey that's going on here. They've reached this climax of it, this sort of almost fulfillment of it, at the most easterly point, where they can still see further east. I think that's an interesting tension. They're as east as they can go, and this splendid thing is happening, but there's the sense of the east over the sea. And these shouts of "Long live King Peter," etc., they achieve, if we were to recast in doctrinal terms, I think we would say that they have achieved a realization in both a sort of a cognitive sense, an understanding, and also a physical sense of realizing and making real of the Imago Dei, the divine image. They have been recognized themselves, they have become kings and queens, and they've been charged with maintaining that. Pardon me. There is something, I think, about the restoration of humanity and being royal, being adopted into the royal family, of course, that language of adoption and being heirs that comes up so much in Paul. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids swimming close to the shore and singing in honor of their new kings and queens. The mer people really sort of made me think this week. I couldn't work out why that seems so significant, and then later on it insists they gave all these honours and glories. And by the way, what really tripped me up is they gave honours to the lion, rewards and honours to their friends, to Tumnus, to the beavers, rumblebuffin leopards, good centaurs, good dwarves, and to the lion. There's a reciprocity of honour and reward. It seems funny to think of giving God a reward. But if there is something sacerdotal about this kingship, if there is something Solomonic about this glorious building, then perhaps this feast has something of the Eucharistic feast about it, about the sacrificial feast, the giving of glory, that there is worship taking place here, that there are things that humans can give to divinity. Not that divinity needs it, but that it is possible to give honour to the lion without that being either pathetic or an oxymoron in some sense. But anyway, that happens. And that night there was a great feast and revelry and dancing, and gold flashed and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing came the music of the sea people. Who are these sea people? Why are we getting them appearing at these climactic moments in the paragraphs? What's going on? And I pondered and I thought, and the only sort of mer people I could think of in the literary tradition that Lewis might be working in was At the End of the World is Too Much with Us by Wordsworth. He's not a terribly Wordsworthian writer, but he had read him, certainly, and Surprised by Joy, I believe, is a quotation from Wordsworth. So this sonnet: the world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending we lay waste our powers, little we see in nature that is ours. We have given away our hearts, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. And Wordsworth, sort of, if not despair, then certainly disgruntlement, rather too mild a word, at the way the world is, and looking out to sea, he thinks, we've wasted all this, we're not dealing with it properly, we don't feel about it properly. I'm not a pagan, but I would even rather be a pagan, someone more in tune with this, because then I might have glimpses of its trueness and its majesty. And I wonder whether it was that because of the connection with paganism that we've seen through the novel, the stone table made of dolmens and the apparent appearance of Pan-like imagery, and the mention of magic and the enchantment of the landscape that's familiar from mid-century writing. Possibly another gathering together of pagan impulses into a Christian metaphysic. Possibly another sense that you don't have to be a pagan to do that, or you can feel those feelings, and they can be part of a glorious Christian metaphysic. But I also thought about the almost apparent insistence that it was unearthly music or unworldly music. That was something that I was getting quite strongly from this. They sang in honour, swimming close to the shore, Answering music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing came the music of the sea people. And that reminded me of some of Lewis's other writings. An obvious example would be The Discarded Image, where he talks about the image of the cosmos, the world picture that is to be found in medieval and early modern writing in English. And other scholars have talked about the relevance of this for Lewis's work. Michael Ward's extraordinary work on the seven heavens in the Narnian fictions, the idea that each book is structured around one of the planets and their associations and their sort of associated words and ideas and powers and even stones in medieval sort of cosmology. But here I was reminded of his discussion of what it's like to look up at the world, for the stars and the sky from a medieval point of view rather than from a modern. And I'll find the passage in question. Now, having talked about various facts about the size and scope and arrangement of the cosmos in the medieval world picture, he says, these facts are in themselves curiosities of mediocre interest. They become valuable only insofar as they enable us to enter more fully into the consciousness of our ancestors by realizing how such a universe must have affected those who believed in it. The recipe for such realization is not the study of books. You must go out on a starry night. I walk about for half an hour, trying to see the sky in terms of the old cosmology. Remember that you now have an absolute up and down. The Earth is really the centre, really the lowest place. Movement to it from whatever direction is movement downward. As a modern, you located the stars at a great distance. For distance, you must now substitute that very special and far less abstract sort of distance which we call height. Height which speaks immediately to our nerves and muscles. The medieval model is vertiginous. And the fact that the height of the stars in the medieval astronomy is very small compared to their distance in the modern will turn out not to have the kind of importance you anticipated. For thought and imagination, 10 million miles and 1,000 miles are much the same. Both can be conceived, that is, we can do sums with both, but neither can be imagined. And the more imagination we have, the better we shall know this. The really important difference is that the medieval universe, whilst unimaginably large, was also unambiguously finite. And one unexpected result of this is to make the smallness of Earth more vividly felt. In our universe, she is small, no doubt, but so are the galaxies, so is everything, and so what? But in theirs there was an absolute standard of comparison. The furthest sphere, Dante's Maggior Corpo, is quite simply and finally the largest object in existence. The word small as applied to Earth thus takes on a far more absolute significance. Again, because the medieval universe is finite, it has a shape, the perfect spherical shape, containing within itself an ordered variety. Hence to look out on the night sky with modern eyes is like looking out over a sea that fades into mist, or looking about one in a trackless forest, trees forever and no horizon. To look up at the towering medieval universe is much more like looking up at a great building. The space of modern astronomy may arouse terror or bewilderment, the vague reverie. The spheres of the old present us with an object in which the mind can rest, overwhelming in its greatness but satisfying in its harmony. That is the sense in which our universe is romantic, and theirs was classical. And again, I've run on a bit there because it's fascinating stuff, and I'm going to find another bit where he suggests that we take a walk at night. After a discussion of the planets and their various influences, he said, and secondly, as that vast though finite space is not dark, so neither is it silent. If our ears were opened, we should perceive, as Henderson puts it, every planet in its proper sphere in moving map and harmony and sound. As Dante heard it in Paradiso 178 and Troilus v 1812. If the reader cares to repeat the experiment already suggested of a nocturnal walk with a medieval astronomy in mind, he will easily feel the effect of these two last details. The silence which frightened Pascal was, according to the model, wholly illusory, and the sky looks black to us only because we are seeing it through the dark glass of our own shadow. We must conceive yourself looking up at a world lighted, warmed, and resonant with music. He later says, I can hardly hope, after more details, I can hardly hope that I shall persuade the reader to yet a third experimental walk by starlight, but perhaps without actually taking the walk, he can now improve his picture of that old universe by adding such finishing touches as this section has suggested. Whatever else a modern feels when he looks out at the night sky, he certainly feels that he is looking out, like one looking out from the saloon entrance onto the dark Atlantic, or from the lighted porch on dark and lonely moors. But if you accepted the medieval model, you would feel like one looking in. The Earth is outside the city wall. When the sun is up, he dazzles us and we cannot see inside. Darkness, our own darkness, draws the veil, and we catch a glimpse of the high pomps within, the vast lighted concavity filled with music and life. And looking in, we do not see, like Meredith's Lucifer, the army of unalterable law, but rather with the revelry of insatiable love. We are watching the activity of creatures whose experience we can only lamely compare to that of one in the act of drinking, his thirst delighted and yet not quenched. For in them the highest of faculties is always exercised without impediment on the noblest of objects, without satiety, since they can never completely make his perfection their own, yet never frustrated, since at every moment they approximate to him in the fullest measure of which their own nature is capable. You need not wonder that one old picture represents the intelligence of the primum mobile as a girl dancing and playing with her sphere, as with a ball. Then, laying aside whatever theology or atheology you held before, run your mind up heaven by heaven to him who is really the centre. To your senses the circumference of all, the quarry whom all these untiring huntsmen pursue, the candle to whom all these moths move, yet are not burned. Now, I've taken you on a bit of a wander there, partly because I love those passages, and I've tried it very occasionally. The experiment he suggests, trying to sort of think yourself into a different situation, and I swear to you this matters for the mer people, because we're coming all the way back to the mer people now. Given the unearthly, literally, feeling around the mer people, given the fact that they appear more or less out of nowhere, we haven't had wise mer people advising the Pevensies where to go, and we haven't had them in the battles or anything. And the insistence on the eeriness, the piercing quality of their music that answers the music of Earth. I think they're angels. Or I'm going to want to modify that, but thinking of them as angels I think is useful, in that there's this pomp in the most positive sense, and ceremony and courtesy and feasting and revelry in a sort of an appropriate way happening on the shore. And this shore is, of course, the most eastward point, and the door is open towards the sea and the utter east beyond it. And then there are these creatures that come towards the shore and sing in this unearthly and piercing way to celebrate the crowning of the Pevensies. I think this, and I was writing that passage about the looking up because of his insistence on distance and finitude and sort of the reality of the world of the medieval model. It's not an abstraction, it's not a set of theories, it's actually a thing. And he says the experience of feeling incredibly small in the way that you feel small when you look up at a cathedral, because you know that is a really big thing, and it's big in the same way that you're big. It's not big in a theoretical or mathematical way. The laws of chance and chaos don't apply to a cathedral, or if they did, it'd fall on you and kill you. So you feel genuinely small because it's measurably big, even if really big. And he also stresses elsewhere that the medieval model doesn't like the idea of vacuum. It isn't attracted or impressed by the idea of vacuity and emptiness in the way that perhaps the Einsteinian universe is. So there are kinds of angel, kinds of celestial being, intelligences that inhabit the various spheres. There are hierarchies of heavenly being, as mentioned at the end there. And I think the mer people are the creatures proper to the sea. And I think the sea is a bit like the heavens here. Not heaven in the Christian sense, but the heavens in the model of the cosmology mentioned there. In that he talks about height and distance are real in the medieval model, and I think we've got a lateral version of that here, where we look out of the doors towards the east, and there are creatures who can answer us, who have some sort of mediating function for us. They can sing back to us. We can see a reflection of some of our activity and some of their activity, and they are sort of meaningfully distant from us. If you, as we spoilers for later books, but if you get in a boat and you sail towards the east, very funny things might happen in Narnia. You might actually get there. You might get through these mediating spaces into further and further spheres. I think we've got the medieval model just taken through 90 degrees here. I think we've got mer people being genuinely unearthly creatures. They're creatures not of the earth, not of the ground, but they're perfectly proper to the sphere or the space in which they swim, and they provide a sense that the heavenly, the non-earthly world is reacting and responding to what is going on quite properly on Earth. So that's my great long tale about it. It's they puzzle me because they seem suddenly to pop out of nowhere and be very important and very apt, and they seem to have better music than everyone else. And in Narnia, that's quite a claim. So yeah, I think we've got a an imagination here by Lewis of what if the medieval cosmology was happening in another in another world, rather like we have what if the Christian narrative was happening in another world. And I think the Mer people key us into to what's going on there. So, moving on from my speculation about the Mer people, which you may or may not accept, I was interested, understandably, I think, by the discussion there of Aslan disappearing. It's another not a tame lion moment. I suggested earlier that the novel could be accused of having a rather underworked pneumatology. Here, I think it possibly pulls some of that back, only slightly, because there's an echo here, I think, of the Spirit blowing where it listeth. The idea that you can't catch and tie down the Holy Spirit. It is breath, it is wind. Has anyone ever managed to catch that and contain it and use it? And I also think there's still a second person of the Trinity issue. I think there's still a sort of a Christology issue here. That despite the fact that Aslan has attended the feast at Cair Paravel, indeed he's basically set it up, and he attends it as an honoured guest, and he's given honour, and he in turn gives honour to them. He doesn't stay there. They can't shut the door and keep Aslan in. They can't mechanically control him, and they shouldn't. It would be terrible to do so. He's not to be contained, even if he appears in things that have materiality, that have architecture. I think there are all sorts of reflections going on here about the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, in the tabernacle, in the church, in Christian institutions, in earthly institutions that are centres of Christian activity. I see a sort of a concentric sequence here of openings out on places where Christ and divinity may be present, but areas where he is not to be controlled and cannot be limited and cannot be mechanically either invoked or kept within those things. And that seems to line up with what I understand of Lewis's theology and his attitude to the Eucharist. We know he took the communion really quite frequently when he was in his college rooms, and indeed stayed over in his college rooms deliberately to attend morning service, whether that was prayers or the Eucharist. So yeah, I think that there's both a warning, but also an opening out of perspective here. I think it would be too simple to say Aslan's gone out the east door, you idiots. That he's simply escaped. Obviously, he's currently paddling over the sea. He's riding a triton somewhere. I think that would be too simple and too reductive. But it is significant, I think, that at this easternmost point there is this building in which Aslan is gloriously present at the feast and imbues the feast with his power and his characteristics, and can't be kept there. And that is a good thing, because that opens out perspectives. We are reminded that this is the easternmost point they have reached and the easternmost building. It isn't the east. And that Aslan's disappearance here, I think, makes sense with the cosmological stuff and with the cardinal direction here with the east. But it warns and it limits one's action towards Aslan in a sense, but limits it, I think deliberately here in a way that literally, in this case, opens up vistas. It opens up spaces. It suggests a broader horizon. Again, the nautical metaphors everywhere. Mer people mixing me up here. But it opens up things rather than closing them down. It warns only to direct towards a more productive and a more grand scope of activity. Then we have the crowning of the. Then we have the names of the Pevensey children. They grow and they do various political things that he approves of. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them. And Peter became a tall and deep-chested man and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of the countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage. And she was called Queen Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always gay and golden-haired, and all the princes in those parts desired her to be their queen, and her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. Then I think we have an interesting combination of titles and characteristics. So we have Peter the Magnificent, and as always with Lewis, it's worth paying attention to the words. He has a long perspective, particularly when it's a word being used as a title, and also particularly when it's a word that has possibly medieval or early modern echoes. So I duly looked up magnificent because I had a sense of what I thought it meant. And here we have in the OED, the etymological section of it, we have the idea that it means, when applied to a person, characterized by greatness of achievement or conduct befitting high position, now only in the magnificent after post-classical Latin magnificus, in case you were wondering, used as a post-modifier entitled to designate a particular distinguished ruler or colloquial any other distinguished person. Whew, right. But what struck me as interesting there is he's not only, doesn't just mean good or splendid, it means the greatness of achievement or conduct befitting high position. So he's suitable. It's almost calling him like King Peter the Kingly, person who fulfills the kingship, person who does things that are suitable to kings. And I think this ends or fulfills Peter's kingship and the problems and the advantages of Peter's kingship that we've seen throughout here. He becomes the magnificent. This idea, I think, of magnificent meaning kingly, we only see perhaps in the idea of a magnifico, in later English, although that does imply like long moustaches, and I don't think Peter necessarily has that. Susan becomes gracious, and she's known as gentle. Again, not just quiet, not just mouse-like, not particularly that, but someone well-bred in the old-fashioned sense. I think someone of courtesy, someone who is elegant, but that elegance befits who she is. Gentle in medieval and early modern English has a dual meaning, I think, of both well-born and well-acting. So someone who is gentle is rather like magnificent means acting appropriately to the kingship. It means acting appropriately to the aristocracy. So someone who fulfills the obligations of nobility, both in a sort of family sense and in a having good manners, and also backing those up with virtuous action. So again, she's someone who fulfills her role of being virtuous and noble at the same time. Edmund, a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment, he was called King Edmund the Just. Just is very interesting here, isn't it? I am advised by those who know Narnia fanfic better than I do, which is to say they know it, that in fanfic, Peter is usually the military leader. Susan is the flirty one who does diplomacy by marrying people or implying she might marry them, her way for the horse in his boy, etc. Lucy is involved in interspecies diplomacy, in that she understands the animals and they understand her and they love her, and that Edmund is often in charge of the civil service and or the intelligence services. He is St. Edmund the Devious, as it were. He's someone who's experienced the shadow side of Narnian life, and uses that in apparently a slightly George Smiley-esque way for the benefit, or what he sees as the benefit of the society in which he lives. It's interesting here that he's not King Edmund the Spy Master, King Edmund of the Circus Piccadilly, but he's Edmund the Just, and that strikes me as interesting. So in one sense, because he's experienced both unjustness and justness, he's suitable to sort of continue that, to propagate justice, the just man justices, as it says in that poem. But I think there's a pun here. I think rather medieval quibbling here on the idea that the just man is the justified man. He's been made just. He has been justified in front of God and the world. That the justness that's been imputed to him, if that's the correct term, by Aslan, now fills him, and that he both does justly, but he has been justified. It's a product. It's an end of the process. And Lucy, the valiant, again, interesting that valiant doesn't just mean fighting in the battle, as Father Christmas warned her. It means a way of life. It means an attitude towards reality and the possibilities of life. Another kind of virtue. So all of them have their particular virtues, but they are all, I think, of a piece with each other. They're the ideal versions of kingship, of rulership, and I think being offered to us as ideal virtues for life, ways of being, even if we aren't royalty ourselves, we can behave with these kinds of virtue. I also found the style interesting here, because the style is growing a bit different. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them, and Peter became a tall and deep-chested man, and Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman, and she was called Queen Susan the Gentle. Now, all of those have full stops in front of them. I'm not going to complain about style here, because I don't always think it's wrong to begin a sentence with a conjunction there, but it's definitely not standard English prose style, definitely not in this period. Dot and, that additive style, additive rather than subordinative, reminds me of two kinds of writing. The Hebrew Scriptures, where the history books often have an and this and that. In fact, you see it also in the Gospels, and Jesus went and travelled, etc. And also in Mallory. Mallory's your great additive stylist, and this, and the knights did that, and he came to him and said, and that, there was great wonder in the land, etc. That full stop followed by the and. And there's something more medieval also, or certainly early modern, about the phraseology. So it was a tall and deep-chested man and a great warrior, fair enough. She grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage. Edmund was a graver and quieter than man, and great in counsel and judgment. There I think we can catch that medieval, or indeed that tang of the Hebrew Scriptures actually, great in counsel and judgment, an archaic style. The children are beginning to be described in a more medieval manner as they become kings and queens of Narnia. They have the tang of the literatures that Lewis loved so much. And this comes out really when they start talking, when they go hunting the stag. Now they go hunting the white stag. I want to emphasise that for two reasons. Firstly, because all the way back at the beginning in chapter 1, I made the point that they imagine different kinds of animals when they imagine the wood. Peter imagines the stag. Edmund imagines the fox, how telling. Lucy imagines the badger. And here, Peter's imagining is coming true. He has imagined this suitable beast for a king to hunt, and then eventually he becomes a king and hunts a white stag. There's also a bit of Mallory, if we needed the proof, which I will read to you here. Mort Darther, Book 3. Then was the high feast made ready, and the king was wedded at Camelot unto Dame Guinevere in the church of St. Stephen's with great solemnity. And every man was set after his degree. Merlin went unto all the knights of the Round Table, and bade him sit still, that none of him remove, for ye shall see a strange and a marvellous adventure. Right so as they sat, there came running in a white hart to the hall, and a white brachet next him, and 30 couple of black running hounds came after with a great cry. And the hart went about the table round as he went by other boards, etc. And the brachet attacks him, and then someone steals the brachet's a hound, and someone steals the brachet. And then there's a quest that lasts for ages and ages and ages. So we're in a distinctly Mallorian world here, the world of chivalric romance and of heroic quests, particularly quests, of course. Mallory's a great one for the quests, as things like the Once and Future King sort of parodied and played upon later. So they're definitely embarked upon a quest infused with the language and the imagery of Mallory, one of the great chivalric writers in the English tradition. And there's touches of that as well in the way they speak. I was particularly struck by this. Then said King Peter, for they talked in quite a different style now, having been kings and queens for so long, fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses and follow this beast into the thicket. For in all my days I never hunted a nobler quarry. Sir, said the others, even so let us do. There are a couple of things there that I think are Mallorian. The use of alight, though I think Mallory probably would have said avoid more frequently, but this elevated high diction appropriate to questing characters. We always sort of blunder into high fantasy here for a moment, don't we? And the fact that all the others reply at once, Sir, said the others, even so let us do. Not even the others all agreed, or yes, said all the others, but quite a complex sentence. Sir, said the others, even so let us do. This is something that I remember from my reading of Mallory, that groups of characters speak unison sentences in quite surprising ways. I'm simply offering that as evidence that we're definitely in the world of medieval diction, and that diction is not only being used by characters, it's making up the reality. So the narrator speaks in it too, or starts to speak in it. And then they come across the lamppost, they tumble through into our world again. And wasn't it striking that earlier when it said, talked about the sea, and it said, oh, the sound of the seagulls, do you remember it? can you hear it? Have you ever heard it? Suddenly we're becoming addressed as if a sound in our world could remind us of Cair Paravel, or somehow we might have been at Cair Paravel in a dream. And they keep talking about, dreams and memories in this chapter. That the world, the gap between Cair Paravel and our world, Narnia and our world, is becoming thinner at that point, where we might accidentally remember something that happened at Cair Paravel, or we might place ourselves at Cair Paravel by hearing a seagull. I thought that was really striking, and then they come tumbling through into our world. And that would have been the very end of the story if it hadn't been that they felt they really must explain to the professor why 4 of the coats out of his wardrobe were missing. So they go and see him, and he doesn't scoff at them. He believes them. Yes, of course you'll get back to Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And don't talk too much about it, even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone else unless you find they've had adventures of the same sort themselves. What's that? How will you know? Oh, you'll know, all right. Odd things they say, even their looks, will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools? And that the insistence that they mustn't go blabbing about Narnia to other people, and they mustn't sit amongst themselves going on and on about it, that again caused me a puzzle. I mean, first of all, it's clearly just a device in the story. It's you can't do the magic easily a second time. The magic won't be systematized. My favorite notion of Lewis's, as I've said. But I think it's certainly very tempting to try and read an explicitly Christian meaning into that. That it's the last passage of the book, and this is clearly a Christian fantasy, one infused with a sense of wonder and with a Christian narrative. And I think there are 2 obvious ways of reading it. First of all, don't get churchy. Having had an experience of God's grace and love, don't try and systematize it, but also don't sit around talking about how you felt. That's not the point. Rather like Lucy sticking around with Edmund, it's not the point to turn inwards and become terribly obsessed with. I mean, to be very stereotypical, don't sit all day reading Percy Dearmer and argue about how other people are using the wrong altar frontals. Don't become churchy in the sort of the old-fashioned sense. Don't obsess on detail. Don't make the experience of God's love into a hobby or a craft activity. And on the other hand, just don't tell other people about it. Don't become a Christianity bore. Don't rush out and insist that everyone else's experience must be the same as yours. Don't go on at people and tell them to have this experience that you've had, and don't try and make them have it. I mean, in doing so, I think if we read it in that way, Lewis is dealing a fairly shrewd swat to 2 of the major traditions of Christianity in this country. The evangelical tradition and the High Church or Catholic tradition. And it's interesting that both of those are potentially readings of the one passage. I think that is part of the meaning of it. Don't become don't become a hobbyist in religion in the same way that Aslan will come and go as Aslan pleases. I don't think that means don't go to church. I don't think it means he's suggesting we should just sort of wander around going, at some point the Spirit will rock up, and that'd be marvellous. But I think that trying to tie that down to a specifically Christian meaning is also failing the professor's test, so to speak. I think that possibly me trying to draw a diagram here and saying, by saying this about Narnia, Lewis is saying, don't do this, attend this kind of church, not this kind of church, indulge in this kind of devotional practice, not that kind of devotional practice. That is me failing the test. That is me trying to tie down and systematize too much. It's me trying to reduce the awe and wonder of the experience of Narnia. I wonder whether the text itself contains not only a warning against certain kinds of religious activity, but certain kinds of reading activity. I worry I might have failed that test since I've just been pondering that, and possibly some of my readings over the last 17 chapters have been guilty, perhaps, of tying things down too much. But I think that's an interesting and a worthwhile place to leave the book, with the book not explained away, with the book opening up its own vistas, rather like that stuff in the last chapter with the door open and looking out over the scene. There is this sense of, I certainly get it from this book, of horizons expanding and of returning to the world we know, with a sense that that world is somehow different. That world is in dialogue with another. Um, I'm reminded of the passage in which Evelyn Underhill talks about the spiritual life being like living in a small, modest hut, but that that hut's on the side of an Alp, and there's this enormous mountain, and there's these great sky and sunlight beyond it, and you're aware of that. And I think that's perhaps some of the effect that we have here, particularly with this last chapter, with its vistas and its royalty and its sense of ceremony, that we are offered a return to the world in which our world is still the world we know, but it's deepened and made strange and made more open, a more airy world almost, by the experience of having read this book. That's certainly how I felt when I got to the end of it. As I say, I'm going to do another episode just to round things off, to talk about sort of themes and ideas that have come up, and to talk about the experience of having gone through it chapter to chapter, and what that's thrown up that I wouldn't otherwise have noticed. So I hope you'll tune in for that. Obviously, there is no reading for that one, but I'm looking forward to discussing with you the experience of reading this really remarkable book in such a plodding and perhaps sometimes overstrained way, but something that's thrown up some real experiences for me of Lewis and the best of his work.